So the topic is very appropriate for the death of the season, as it were. You may recall that we started the season with the discussion on death. So this is not to be confused with, there might be sort of death-related aspects to death, but that's not the focus today. This is about defining death. And we are very happy to have two prominent speakers on this from very different disciplinary perspectives, as it were. Hannu Sariola, Professor of Developmental Biology, with a medical, as it were, perspective, and Sami Pihlström, philosopher, Director of the Coalition for Advanced Study, representing the humanistic or philosophical point of view. I just want to share some sort of advertising observations in a few minutes before I give the floor to our two speakers. About defining death, we have multiple definitions, from very sort of natural scientific to something very commonsensical, like death defined as an irreversible end of brain activity due to total, and there you go, with some jargon in natural science, biology and all that, to a very commonsensical idea of death amounting to the end of memory traces about a person. Somebody lives as long as there is somebody else to remember that person and things of that kind. Now here is one question that our speakers might address or might not, I don't know. Is defining life a necessary or even a sufficient condition for defining death? How is the concept of life related to that of death? Just a few observations about the cultural importance of death. This was something that I sort of was quite fascinated about when I started finding about it. It's not only the case that there is cultural variation in dealing with death and including defining death. That's something we know about. Cultural anthropologists have informed us about this kind of cultural variation, but also that there would be no human culture at all without the inevitability of death. Human culture is dependent on death. If we were immortal, we wouldn't have culture. So here's a choice. If we were to want to be immortal, we wouldn't have culture. If you want to have culture, we need to die, and we need to be aware of that. Dying, in this sense, death is a necessary condition of the emergence and existence of culture. Here are some very juicy and elegant passages from Zygmunt Bauman, the sociologist. Culture is the sediment of the ongoing attempt to make the living with the awareness of mortality livable. If by any chance we were to become immortal, culture would grind to a halt. It was precisely the knowledge of having to die, of the non-negotiable brevity of time, of the possibility or likelihood of visions remaining unfulfilled, projects unfinished, and things not done, that spurred humans into action and human imagination into flight. I wonder how far this sort of applies, or how closely this applies to sort of academic people like us, or whether it's equally applicable to just anyone, but I'm sure it applies to people like we. It was that knowledge that made cultural creation a necessity and turned humans into creatures of culture. The engine of culture was the need to fill the habits separating transience from eternity, finitude from infinity, mortal life from immortality. This, I think, is somewhat interesting. I have no idea whatsoever whether our speakers will address issues of this kind, but it is part of the larger set of questions for sure. Now, death surely plays a causal role in the structure of the world in many ways. It's caused by other things such as poverty, famine, medical mistreatment, murder, traffic accident, disease, etc. Some of them more proximate, some of them less so. And death itself is a cause of many, many other things, such as I just suggested, of culture, sorrow, of the collapse of an organization, etc., etc., etc. And now one of the interesting questions that our speakers again might or might not address is whether defining death is completely independent of its roles in the causal structure of the world, natural or social. I mean, these two things, defining what death is and placing death in the causal structure of the world, are these two entirely independent tasks, or are they somehow related to one another? And then yet another observation, sometimes, at least for some purposes, it's probably important to make a distinction between defining and detecting. It seems that in some of the background readings, for instance, that were supplied, there was no clear distinction between these two things, but at least for some purposes it seems a useful distinction to make. So defining is a matter of answering the question, what is death? Rather than what causal roles does death play as a cause or as an effect. We have the idea of defining death either directly or defining the concept of death, and thereby indirectly defining death. And then it's another kind of thing to detect or help detect death by specifying the indicators that then serve as criteria for detecting instances of death, or specifying criteria for applying the concept of death, and then applying those criteria in actual concept use. So this might be something that may, and I hope will, emerge in the discussion in the next few minutes. So, and finally, I'll list the questions that already have been put forth in the announcements of this event. So these questions are supposed to be answered, or at least dealt with or touched upon by our two speakers, so as to keep this discussion organized. Can death be defined in the first place? Is this a possible endeavor or something impossible? What kinds of definition are available? There are many, many kinds of definition available. What kinds are those? How do the definitions differ? What do they share? So comparing those definitions with one another, identifying similarities, identifying differences between them. Then the question of what sort of purposes those different definitions might serve, and if they serve different purposes, what consequences this might have for our assessments of those definitions. Do those definitions compete with one another, or are they complementary? So do we need to choose between them? Choose one instead of another? Or can we have them all, provided they all serve some useful purposes? And finally, what would have to be discovered for us to formulate a general theory of life and death? I think this was your proposal for inclusion in this list, so we are eager to learn from you about this issue. All right, so these are the questions, and now we are very, very keen to learn about the answers to these questions by our two speakers, and Hannu Sarjala will start, and Sami will be next.
Thank you very much, Uskalit, for your nice introduction to this team, and I just want to add one background information that is probably quite important, because I'm also a pediatric pathologist. I'm not only academic professor, but also doing clinical work with dead bodies. And that somehow is reflected in this talk as well. So that I don't claim that I'm a professional in death. but I have just to work with it and scope it. And the questions that you already mentioned will be discussed first against the life, because you can't say that when you break a stone, you kill the stone, or can you? But if you break a worm and kill it, then you can say that you are a killer. So that we are having a clear view that death is possible only for living creatures. And then the problem is that what is then life? And to be honest, this can be a very short story, because I can say that nobody knows what is life. Because we know life only from this planet, and in one case you can't make a rule, you can't make a definition. You have to find life somewhere else in the space. And then we probably sometimes in future know what is life. And then it closes the story, because you can't define the life, you can't define death. And that's all. But this is not the reality, because we know that we are alive, and we know that we die. And then this is the story. Now we start going through the events that we know are existing. And the way how I approach this, I asked from our colleagues in Biomedicum in Hartman, in Meilahti area anyway, that what is life, and they mostly said, I don't know, I don't care. Most physicians don't care about life. And Italian postdoc in our laboratory said that life is sometimes very nice. And the Finnish postdoc said that I have never time to finish anything. Series of unexpected events and coughing cells and organisms. Life is reproduction, said the gynecologist. And this is a real student. He said that this complicated mixture of physical-chemical reactions that under certain conditions give rise to more than the total of the contributing reactions. Wow, full points. Boring. Cardiologist said that life is respiration of cells. Pathologist said that life is contrary to death. And he said that life for him meant that he wants to be happy. And the life is time before death, heart beating, descriptions of various states. I mean, all kinds of features that happen, people know that happen with life. And tired mother said, I have already divided, don't ask me. Life is teaching, said the professor. Life is people, food and sex, that's also right. And the head of the previous Institute of Health and Welfare said that now this is the right answer. Nowadays life in Finland is for men 76 years and for women 84 years. Boom. And that's the story. So what do we learn? We learn that you can't define life, that's very clear to all of us, but we can define the features of life. We can say that life has certain characteristics, and we can collect these features and characteristics that when we find life or something that looks like life somewhere else on exoplanets, then we can see that this is a planet that is interesting, much more interesting than the other planets that don't show these features. And David has published a list of these features, and there are several other lists, but I just want to list these because, I mean, they all are very much the same. It's independent. The wind blows and the clouds follow with the wind, and sometimes you can see that the clouds don't follow, and then you can see that maybe this cloud is alive. It reproduces, it has its own metabolism, it consumes energy, it's complex, it's highly organized, and it grows and develops, and the information is built in the machine itself. And that's it. And now when we compare this list with the existing life forms, we can say, yes, 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 we are humans, we fulfill all the criteria of living creatures. The mule doesn't reproduce, it doesn't fulfill this feature. And then viruses, they are not anymore very much alive, but the computer virus that we have made has exactly the same characteristics. And the dry seed that we know is alive, if we send the dry seed to atmosphere or to space, it can stay alive without showing any evidence of life, because it's not producing, it's not growing, it's not evolving, it doesn't have the metabolism, etc. And so when we cannot define life, we cannot define death. But when we go through the list of various theories of beginning of life, we have very interesting story, because eternal life theory indicates that it has always been there. As long as we have had space, the life has been there. This theory was presented by Vernadsky, Russian. And then we have this very beautiful panspermia, so that we have kind of life growing all over from planet to planet. And there is good evidence at the moment that there are amino acids in the cold space. And most likely this is very close to become more prevailing theory, and it's very interesting and beautiful theory. And it was presented by Svante Arrhenius from Denmark. And it probably evolved in hot water and tropical lagoons, but then recently it was also presented that maybe it was developing in the bedrock, because that made kind of shield for the first cell, because we know that the basic unit of all or most life forms is cell, and the bedrock as a material could have provided this shape, mold to start it. Okay, because we know only life on this planet and nowhere else, it is already very clear that it's a very, very rare event. And if we think of a simple protein with 20 amino acids, the likelihood is 10 to minus 40,000. It's very, very unlike. But this unlike event becomes possible if you have enough time and if you have unlimited number of chemical reactions. And that's why in the scale of universe, the life is probable. Earlier it was thought that the death material can create life. And Jan Baptista von Helmont did an experiment in 1622, and he described this result. Put a dirty skirt in an open barrel, add seeds, and after 21 days mice are born. Exact. I have been working all my life with mice, and Thomas knows that the pregnancy of mice is 21 days. So, the spontaneous creation was killed by Louis Pasteur, 1859, with an experiment where the bottle was filled with sugar liquid, and the open bottle was infected and was full of life, and the same liquid with sworn neck that prevented the inflow of bacteria remained sterile and was without life. But in fact, already in 1668, the father of experimental medicine, Francesco Redi, did the same experiment. he used meatballs. He put the meatballs in open and closed bottles, and only when the bottle was open, it was soon full of life forms. So spontaneous creation story from life from death is not anymore valid, but it is. Because Stanley Miller and Sidney Fox, Nobel laureates, did the experiment. First, Stanley Miller combined water, methane, and ammonia to build up amino acids, and it was working. And Sidney Fox showed that the artificial proteins can be developed from the amino acids, so that we can create material of life from death material. And that happens in the universe all the time. These chemical reactions are very simple, and that's why it's one of the basic events in the space. So, in our life forms, the basic unit is cell. And Greg Venter has analyzed how many cells, how many genes are needed to make a living cell. And this approximation was done based on the genome projects from various bacteria, viruses, and eukaryotes. And he published his results in 2010, and it's approximated 300 genes. And with these totally biosynthetic genes that he packed in the mycoplasm, he could make a totally biosynthetic life form. And so boring paper is probably the key paper of this century. And it's the beginning. It took 10 years. But from this on, this kind of biosynthetic life is going to be more and more common and will be used for more and more purposes in technology and in medicine, etc. And this is from Hufvudstadsbladet, and I think it's very nice. I think this envisions the future. We will see these type of features, creatures and features in animals much more and more in near future. And as a developmental biologist, I always ask, is it possible or not? Tuomas, you know, you are a biologist. You also know. Is it possible or not? Is this fake? And this is of course fake, but I mean theoretically, can we do this type of six-legged pig? No? Propose. Yes or no? Yes. Yes, and why? Because we are worms with segments, and we can duplicate the segment and make 2 more legs, but we cannot make 3 legs or 5 legs, because the duplication results a new segment for our body, and this is right. Hufvudstadsbladet, bra magazine. Okay. Okay, the first thesis is that because we cannot define life, we cannot define death. But that's boring, because the death is there all the time. Life without death doesn't exist. When we are born, we know that we are going to die. And death has various definitions, and I think the important medical definition is the political one. We have in Finland the first law on brain death in the world. 2001, Kansas was the first place in the world, but it's not state. We are the first state where the death was defined in legislation, so that when you are brain dead, you are dead, even though your heart is beating. So that one organ is dead and all other organs are alive, And why is this definition important? Because then we can get organ transplants, and that's why it's important. And it's working pretty well, so that the end of brain function means death, even though the body, other organs of the body are alive. The abortion law in Finland says that you can get abortion if the fetus is less than 22 weeks. Please.
Just do we know for sure that the brain is dead?
Good question. The official answer is that of course we know, because it's analyzed with EEG, and it's analyzed physically. I mean, all these type of patients are analyzed, and all neurological functions are tested. But then you have these very rare cases, the sensational cases that some people have waked up being dead for weeks or months. It's a very difficult point. But I don't know. If we don't use the brain death definition, then we don't get organs for transplantation. And that's it. It's so brutal. Whole Europe is nowadays following the Finnish way. And the brain death is accepted in most countries as a major definition of death. And it's a political issue. We need the organs to help people. Otherwise, many people die because the shortage of the transplantable organs. It's tough. Okay, abortions can be done before 22nd weeks of gestation, and the gestation weeks are counted from the beginning of the last menstruation period, and it means that the embryo is on average 20 weeks. And if it's born spontaneously or after induced abortions, then the embryo at that stage is so immature that it cannot live. I mean, it's not compatible with life outside of the uterus. And thereafter, if the embryo or the fetus is dying spontaneously, it's miscarriage or stillborn. And we make in Finland 16,000 abortions because of medical or social reasons annually. And we have about 200, 300 stillborn babies. And these numbers tell how common are deaths before birth. Every 8th fetus is going to die during embryogenesis. And if we are expanding this to the first weeks of pregnancy, the spontaneous abortion rate goes up to 70. You ladies remember this when you start making the baby at the age of 45. Because the pregnancies are very often terminated spontaneously. Then people cry that, oh, that's it, my life is totally destroyed. Then we have the fact that the death is not black and white. If we follow the death of people, I mean, the first organ that is destroyed after the cardiac arrest, for example, is brain. It's very sensitive to hypoxia. But then the skin and liver and kidneys, they are quite tolerant, so that they survive hours. And because of this tolerance, it's possible to take these organs and put them to cooler and transplant after one day to somebody who is needing these organs. So the death is a sequential process and not at all black and white at a certain time point. Then we have this ecological definition. We have the death of an individual versus the extinction of the species. because I mean the individual is dying, but in most cases and many cases he has produced littermate. We call them babies. And they continue life, and they have the same genetic material. And that's why you can think that your life is going on in these children. And that's why the species extinction is the final death of certain species and the final death of this type of life. Not before that. And then we have, of course, these psychological definitions. I mean, for me, who work with the death babies and fetuses every day, death is just normal day, another day like all others. But for those who get the first, are having the first pregnancy and then the baby is dying or the fetus is dying, it's totally unnatural. It's total catastrophe. And we physicians, we easily make mistakes when we say that this is natural. You know for sure that the life is trying to try to clean the malformed babies, and that's why it's easy. I mean, it's the best thing that happened that this is now. Then, I mean, it's not like this. For these women that have miscarriage, it is a very sensitive and difficult psychological process. Okay, I have 4 children, and these are mine and daughter-in-law and mine, and you can see that they are heavily pregnant, and that was a year ago. And of course, because of the background, I mean, you know, I was convinced that at least one is going to die. Because but we can see, I mean, there are this type of creatures that are totally malformed and look ugly looking. They are everyday job for pediatric pathologists. And this is the outcome. 3 completely healthy, beautiful ladies, female musketeers, and not a sign of any malformation, and totally alive. Yesterday we were biking around the Vanhan Kaupunkilahti, and it was fun. So maybe it's good that you take the realistic aspect. I mean, our life is most likely this 84 years and so forth. But because of Mother's Day, Helsingin Sanomat published The Dark Side of the Coin. Read Räty's very beautiful article. I don't know whether anyone has read it. But I mean, it was very touching because she's handling this situation, the miscarriage problem and stillborn problem, and it is really kind of holy thing. You don't speak about that if that has happened to you, because you don't want to say that, okay, it failed. And still it is really very sensitive, and these quotations, kuolema löi äitiä kasvoihin, sinusta ei elämä jatku, sinä kuolit, tai sitten ei ole mitään. Or this viimeisen ponnistuksen jälkeen avasin silmäni ja näin kalpean lapsen roikkuvan kätilön kädellä. They tell how much this brings suffering to those who remain. I mean, ironically, then it's very easy. To those who die, thereafter you don't feel anything. That's it. But those who are following it and remain here, then they are suffering. And that's why, for example, these suiciders, they are trying to punish the other people, and they are really making really bad things for the survivors, those who remain. Death is inevitable, and it comes when it comes. And some die in utero, some die during the birth, sometime after it, and sometimes we are having a long life. The longest living people are something like 100 120,000 almost, 116, 80,000 at least. That doesn't really matter, because there's a huge variation. It matters that when you die, you have to have the right diagnosis, because then we know that the medicine has done all its best and all it can do. We can't rescue, and our aim, the aim of medicine is not to rescue people to eternal life, but to cure diseases that they have so that they maybe continue living a couple more years. Okay, the last question that we probably cannot answer, kind of theory of death and life. I mean, it's like this tree. It's the tree of life. And it doesn't grow and flourish without death, because that's the same thing and the same process. Just the beginning and the end. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Uskali, so much for this opportunity to participate in this discussion. Let me So I'm supposed to be providing the perspective of the human sciences, or the human and social sciences, including philosophy, into this discussion. First, I should note that there will probably be no major controversy here. I mean, I'm not going to deny any medical or biological facts about death or dying, or about life for that matter. So what I'm hoping to do is to provide some maybe philosophical perspective, or to discuss some philosophical contexts or frameworks in which these matters may become relevant, and also may lead to different definitions. So just a couple of words about the background of my own interest in this topic. We've had, at the Helsinki Collegium for Advanced Studies, we've had an interdisciplinary so-called Argumenta project. It's part of the funding scheme of the Finnish Cultural Foundation. So that's been a kind of an interdisciplinary project with many people involved, coordinated by Outi Hakola, who's actually here. And I've been leading this project. It's almost coming to its end now. A couple of more events available, so check our website if you're interested in what we've been doing within that project. So some conceptual preliminaries. Sorry for the PowerPoint. I mean, I don't have any fancy pictures, just words, typical philosophers' PowerPoint. That's it. I'm sorry about that. So we might, of course, distinguish. These are just some very basic conceptual distinctions that may have to be made if we want to define death or talk about defining death. We need to move on from the relatively vague concept of death itself that may refer to a phenomenon, a process, perhaps an event or even a state, to some other concepts. We may talk about dying, of course, which is the process leading to death. And then one question that would have to be discussed here would be when exactly that process begins, whether it begins already in birth. On the other hand, we just heard that you might actually die before you were born, so that's also a problematic matter when that process actually begins. We know that all living creatures at some point die, but then we could also define dying as something that happens after a certain moment, kind of a threshold moment, after which there is no way of preventing death anymore. Then we can talk about mortality. Of course, it's a concept that is often used in a statistical sense, but it can also be spoken about as a state or potentiality of living beings. Living beings are mortal. That is, they have the potentiality to die, and that potentiality will be actualized at some point. And I suppose in some sense, the answer to the question whether we need to define life in order to define death would be positive. Of course, these concepts are very intimately intertwined, but at least insofar as we are seeking any sort of definition at all, I think we do need to consider both. But then I'm not at all sure that we could somehow define these concepts independently of each other. I'm very doubtful about that. Furthermore, we could talk about the moment of death, which would then be some like the dividing moment, or the moment ending the process of dying. But this might actually be a temporally extended moment and would in fact have to be some kind of a process itself. So it's not clear that there is anything like the moment of death that would be identifiable in any real cases. Furthermore, being dead is something like a state of the being that has died. And again, we shouldn't say that inanimate beings are in such a state because they never lived. And one further distinction would be the one between death and something that is sometimes called deathless annihilation. We might say that, for instance, in a case in which a bacteria divides into two or splits into two different bacteria, the original one doesn't anymore exist after the division has taken place. It didn't die, but it doesn't exist anymore. So there is a way of, even for living beings, to cease to exist without actually dying, at least without dying in the same way in which we think of ourselves as eventually dying. So I'm not saying that we would have to define all these concepts in any absolute precise manner in order to be able to define death, but we have to have some kind of an understanding of these conceptual distinctions in order to move on in this kind of discussion. Furthermore, there is the distinction between definition and criterion. This is something that Uskali already referred to in the opening remarks. A definition tells us what something is, or perhaps what something essentially is. I'll get back to the topic of essentialism in a moment. So, at least ideally, it provides us with the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to fall under the concept. Whereas a criterion is something different. It is something that we find useful in enabling us to identify actual objects or cases or events falling under this concept that we're applying here. So if we compare this to other philosophical concepts or philosophical debates, philosophers working on truth often remind us that we need to be clear about the distinction between the definition of truth, which gives us the meaning of this concept, and the criteria of truth that can be used in identifying truths. For instance, correspondence could be the meaning of truth, even while coherence or some other criteria could be used in identifying truths. And similarly, we could have, for instance, a biological definition of death as something like the permanent, irreversible discontinuation of life processes, or whatever along those lines, while having some specific phenomena such as the termination of brain activity used as the criteria by means we identify that a death has occurred. So this relates to the discussion of brain death in Hannu Karila's talk. And of course there is a large number of more specific definitions. For instance, if you take a look at the recent Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy articles on death and the definitions of death, you will find a lot of discussion of this and lots of references. So we might say that defining death is something like a conceptual or perhaps even ontological project or matter, whereas there is also this separable epistemological question or project of determining the occurrence of death. And these are two different matters, at least insofar as we find ontology and epistemology separate. I'm not sure if we eventually should follow this line of thought, but I'm just sort of bringing this up as a kind of a basic philosophical distinction. Of course, to say that these things are separable or that there has to be a conceptual distinction along these lines is not to say that they wouldn't be related. Obviously, whatever criterion we choose to use in this kind of a discussion, it should be somehow useful precisely for determining whether that given concept defined in some particular way applies to an actual case. So certainly they are not completely different matters, although technically separate. Then, if we move on to this discussion concerning the different perspectives that medicine, or more generally, biomedical research and humanistic research bring to this debate, I think when we approach this issue of defining death as a kind of a debate between different perspectives, medical and humanistic, this debate has, insofar as there is any debate at all, it has its context in the more basic or broader philosophical opposition between naturalistic and humanistic approaches to the human condition generally. Or we might talk about philosophical anthropology, that is philosophical investigations of what it means to be human. That's a phrase that is not so popular nowadays. Most philosophers prefer to avoid such a phrase, and certainly I just use it here in a very neutral sense, not subscribing to any specific doctrines in philosophical anthropology. Now, one more distinction that needs to be taken up insofar as we approach this matter from the point of view of this dialogue between medical and humanistic perspectives is the distinction between meaning and significance. In defining death, we of course are primarily interested in the meaning of this concept, in the question of what death is. But then there is also something that we can call the question of significance, that is the human, cultural, perhaps existential significance of the phenomenon or the relevant phenomena invoked here. And this is also something that obviously philosophy and the other humanities ought to discuss. Now, one, in my view, helpful way of investigating the different frameworks or contexts in which defining death may be possible, or the contexts that may lead to different definitions or different ways of approaching this entire issue. I find one helpful approach in a kind of a fourfold scheme of types of philosophical anthropology or philosophical approaches to the human being. I'm referring here to an old paper by one of our colleagues, Heikki Kannisto, now retired. The younger generation here wouldn't probably know this old essay, available only in Finnish, in the yearbook of the Philosophical Society of Finland, Ajatus. It's about the possibility of philosophical anthropology, and I'm sort of very briefly hoping to use this fourfold scheme here. Let me first say, however, that if we subscribe to one of these biological definitions, for instance, to quote one of the recent encyclopedia articles, the definition of death as the irreversible cessation of organismic functioning, or something like that, One of the questions, obviously, is if we want to continue this dialogue between the medical and the humanistic perspectives, the question is whether this suffices for defining human death in particular, or whether we need some additional definition, such as the irreversible loss of personhood or something like that. This already leads to major complications, because one could argue that to be human and to be a person are not the same thing. For instance, a fetus or even a stillborn child is certainly, or wasn't certainly, a person. It might have been potentially a person and so forth. There, on the other hand, there could be non-human persons, like maybe some animals or extraterrestrials, if there were any, and obviously there are human beings who have lost person or lost full personhood at least. So this is a complicated matter. Furthermore, going back to the distinction between a definition and a criterion, it might be entirely plausible to propose a biomedical criterion or standard or whatever, such as brain death suitably specified, for determining the occurrence of death, while still requiring that the definition of the concept itself should be defined in a broader way, including also socio-cultural dimensions. So that's why I think something like a typology of philosophical ways of thinking about humanity more generally, and thus about human death, is helpful in this situation. Now, because of some time pressure, I will have to move on very quickly. So I would refer to the readings and to the article that I mentioned for further discussions of this. Anyway, essentialism is of course the classical way to start. This would be the first type of philosophical approaches to the human being and also to death on my list of 4 different approaches derived from Kannistu's paper. So ideally, of course, a definition should provide the essence of the phenomenon defined. And here again, we must distinguish between the essence of a human being generally and the essence of this phenomenon of death. Now, obviously, essentialism is a classical framework for thinking about what human beings are and what our death is or means for us. We can just think about Plato's, Aristotle's, and other classical philosophers' theories of the human being and about the world generally. There is the idea of something like a teleological world order, or somehow normatively structured cosmical order within which we have our own specific place. And now the worry, of course, here is that there may not be sufficient scientific grounding for such classical essentialist conceptions of humanity. So the second possible approach, scientific naturalism, arises as a denial of some of the basic ideas of essentialism. There are just the objective natural facts about us, including facts about our biological death that apply to us as much as to any other biological creatures. And naturalism in a broad sense is, of course, the starting point for any biomedical ways of defining death. One philosophical worry here, obviously, as in all discussions of naturalism, which I won't be able to go into any details of here, one worry is reductionism. If we have a purely naturalistic approach, the phenomenon of death may lose its what may be called its human significance. So to move on to the third possible approach, which may be called culturalism, this would be something in which the socio-cultural dimensions of human life generally and human deaths in particular would be emphasized. So here death would mean much more than a mere discontinuation of our biological activities, although of course it's that too, there would be no point in denying that. We can and do talk about the death of various cultural and social structures or formations such as languages, sciences maybe, or religions, maybe nations and so forth. We could say that culturalism generally re-establishes the kind of normative structure that the original essentialism presupposed, but now conceives of this as something that is human-made instead of given to us. As many philosophers have put it, we in a way live in a symbolic cultural world in addition to living in a physical universe. There was one previous aid session devoted to the topic of social ontology, and this would obviously be a way to connect to that if we had any more time. One problem in culturalism is the threat of so-called cultural relativism. Eventually, the facts about these normative orders would just be further facts about the way in which we human beings, in fact, live in different societies. So this would also lead to problems. Finally, I will basically skip existentialism here because it's it may not be so close to our topic. It's of course one of the major sources for 20th century and I suppose beyond philosophy about human mortality and death and dying as human phenomena. So I move on to some of the final remarks, a few more slides. Now, I think an interesting challenge for philosophy of death and mortality is to integrate some of the plausible aspects of these different rival types of philosophical anthropology that might also be seen as different or rival types of philosophical thanatology, if we want to use such a phrase, although it's not, of course, not generally used. First, we may be unable to completely abandon the original classical quest for a definition that was inspired by essentialism. Although we have to take seriously whatever it is that the most advanced natural sciences teach us about human life and death. We certainly cannot return to classical teleology or other essentialist ways of thinking, but on the other hand, we should somehow maintain the idea of a culturally structured, normative world order we sort of made ourselves. Whereas also fighting or at least challenging the reductive tendencies of cultural relativism. So this is a matter of integrating some different strengths of these different approaches. Now, one key point here, given our topic, is something like a synthesis of naturalism and culturalism. So if we want to have a genuine dialogue between the medical or biological approaches and the humanistic or sociocultural ones, on the other hand, we need to consider this broader project of, as I say, critically synthesizing naturalistic and culturalistic conceptions of humanity and conceptions of death. This is arguably essentially a Kantian project, a continuation of the Kantian project of reconciling, or at least making compatible, the realms of nature and freedom. Of course, I won't be able to go into that in any historical detail. If I think of the kind of work that I've done myself in philosophy in relation to this kind of issues, the tradition that I've been working most on is the pragmatist tradition, and that I think might also offer a promising perspective to this kind of mediation between naturalism and culturalism. Although I will have to skip the further details about that here. So I move on to my final slide. If we want to return to this question concerning definition or defining death, one proposal here is that we might think of death as a family resemblance concept in Wittgenstein's sense, that is something that doesn't really have an essence, because, for instance, the deaths of, for instance, cells or human persons, or perhaps biological species, or perhaps more metaphorically of scientific theories or cultures or whatever, are all quite different phenomena, yet they do seem to have something to do with each other, so they're not completely different either. So I don't think we should reduce the concept of death to biological concepts. If somebody proposed that we should reduce the concept of death to physical concepts, that would hardly even make sense, because the entire distinction between life and death wouldn't be relevant there. So a physical definition of death would already lose that distinction, which would have to be presupposed in talking about death in the first place. So that kind of a reduction wouldn't make sense. The biological reduction probably would make sense, but still it would lose various cultural dimensions of death that we probably want to include in our concept of death. So what I'm sort of proposing here is a kind of pragmatic pluralism. We may have different definitions. I mean, yes, we can certainly define death, and we can define death in many ways. And these different definitions are, as definitions, generally useful or more or less useful for different human purposes. For instance, there are clearly legal needs for a definition of death, and we may have different, at least to some extent different definitions in different contexts. Let's say legal, scientific, medical or clinical, maybe military, maybe theological. That would introduce yet another quite different perspective. All these would categorize the relevant phenomenon or phenomena quite differently, yet they would have to have something to do with each other. And here the purpose of philosophical inquiry into this concept or related concepts would precisely be to somehow coordinate this interdisciplinary debate on the various possible definitions there are, and perhaps also on the related criteria that might be used. So I don't think there is any purely philosophical purpose for defining death. I don't think there is a final philosophical truth about death available, and I'm not sure if that's even a meaningful goal. I think of philosophy as playing this role of coordination. And for that reason, I also find the fourfold typology, only very briefly introduced here, useful. So thank you very much.
All right. Do you want to, Herbert, in response to what he said, or?
Let's open discussion.
All right. So let me try to organize the setup that we have now on the table. So it seems that we have a hard time in generating a debate. I mean, you don't seem to disagree on anything. It's very reconciliatory, as it were. And the strategies of reconciliation seem to be based on sort of recognizing the plurality of purposes that can be served by different definitions of death. And the other way of proceeding towards a reconciliation is to distinguish between concepts and criteria, or defining and detecting. It seems, for instance, when the other brain death, as you have been talking about, can be put forth as a criterion. After all, it's not maybe a definition of what death is, but it provides a criterion for detecting or identifying cases of death and things of this kind. But of course, this could perhaps be a place for some debate, for prompting, say, moral issues or things like that. There's an epistemic uncertainty there in detecting or applying those criteria. perhaps. And then the question is how we deal with these uncertainties, and that's partly not just an epistemic issue, but also an ethical issue. So there is some room for debate there, perhaps. I wonder, by the way, why you call that a political definition?
It is political.
Political
it's
because
confirmed, it's a legal issue, and then it's a political issue. Because it's in the law, and the laws are political.
Okay. And the purpose being shared by this criteria,
Yeah.
rather than
And the
definition,
purpose
these
for
two-
the introduction of the brain death legislation in Finland was to get more organ transplants.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds great.
But we are not at the top. I mean, the highest rate of organ transplantations in Nordic countries in Norway. And the Finnish physicians travel to Norway to learn how they are doing it better. They have 2 times more, almost 2 times more organ transplantation than we have. It means a lot for many, many people. Okay, side.
All right. There's a further. I mean, in the opening, I suggested that there are issues of causation around death. Death is caused, and death is a cause of other things. And as this was not, that didn't really much in either of your talks. But I just started wondering when Sami says that the death of an individual is much more than a mere discontinuation of the biological activities of an organism. What exactly is this much more? I mean, at least some of this much more could be construed as causes and consequences of death in cultural and social terms. But then my question would be, what parts of that much more in the cultural social care would actually enter the very concept of death, rather than just being part of its causes and consequences?
That's an excellent question, and I didn't really offer any answer to anything like that because I didn't subscribe to any specific definition of it. So whether socio-cultural or anything else, I just sort of indicated that the mere biological concept wouldn't include at all such elements of death as well, for instance, you also referred to sorrow or something like that. That could be regarded as relevant to the concept itself. Although again, it's not so clear, of course, what to include in the concept or definition itself. And again, I would probably want to refer back to the pluralistic idea of having different definitions for different purposes, and certainly it's a good thing for, let's say, medicine to stay away from those like unnecessary like extra dimensions that wouldn't be helpful in the medical project of understanding life or death. They would just hinder the medical investigation, for instance. You shouldn't pay attention to such irrelevant dimensions of the phenomenon when you are approaching it from the medical point.
I a little bit disagree, because I mean, we have in the hospitals, we have hospital priests, we have and so forth. So we try to accept that this is a situation where people face very deep sorrow. And if you don't accept it, then you make harm. Then you harm diagnostics.
What I meant was that when you want to determine the medical cause, for instance, the disease itself,
The
then,
legislation,
if that's your medical context,
That's totally.
then you don't take into account these social factors or something like that. But then, of course, when you take care of the patient, there in the hospital, you also need to, at least to some extent, consider the family and so on.
Okay, with Katarina and then Adrian.
Just to follow up on this last discussion, it seems to me like, yes, this idea of having like different criteria, definitions of that for different purposes sounds difficulties arise in situations where actually different, there must be situations in which different definitions conflict, and that's where that's where the difficulties arise. And now, I'm not an expert, but I can think about the discussion on whether to declare someone dead when its brain stops working. That's actually a case in which whether you take a more a different definition, like less biomedical definition of life and death, that might matter. It's just to say that this is just to try to complicate a bit matters for Sami, perhaps, in the sense of this idea that different definitions are good for and criteria that are good for different purposes. It's good one on paper, but then its value is going to be put in question when you actually have situations in which different definitions are going to give you different practical consequences, and then you have to choose one. Which one? Are we going to go with the biomedical one, or are we going to go with a more cultural, social one?
So I think that this is a very important question, because it's not a philosophical and it's not a biomedical issue, it's a religion that defines. The different religions define how we think of the embryogenesis. In Catholic countries, the life begins and the human begins by fertilization. At fertilization. And it means that it's a one single egg and nothing else. But still, the Catholic Church is considering it as a human being. And that's why the abortions are illegal in Catholic countries. So that if you are raped in Ireland, then you can't get abortion, even though the outcome is result of illegal act. But it's not a philosophical issue. It's a religious issue. Where this most diversity is seen.
Right. But I guess the philosophical issue might be precisely this: that in cases of conflict, we don't really have here any like final or meta level definition of death or theory of death that would then tell us what to do, which more specific or context embedded or interest relative definition to rely on when there is a complicated case. And I completely agree that's a major problem. I don't think there would be any need for this kind of discussion if there wouldn't be such problems in the first place. And that's precisely why we need, for instance, ethical reflection. And the work of a moral philosopher, for instance, cannot simply be constructing some elaborate argument that finally leads to the view that a certain action is morally permissible or impermissible. It would have to be also a reflection on these different contexts in which different purposes or interests are at work, and which may then lead to different ways of even defining the relevant concepts, such as the concept of death. And that's why I don't think there is any easy way to like a final solution to that kind of difficulties. It often needs kind of a case-by-case reflection. Very often matters of life and death in, let's say, in a hospital context are like really unique phenomena that needs to be reflected on in also a very personal manner. And of course, religious beliefs held by the patient or the family or whatever might come to the picture there. But I suppose we should, from the philosophical point of view, we probably should be opposed to the idea that religion simply determines us to think in a certain way. We should obviously take a critical attitude to that.
This follows on from that. I'm interested in this idea about the pluralism that you were talking about, Sami, and also the conflict between naturalistic understandings of death and the humanistic ones. And I suppose the question here is whether there's a I mean, are you suggesting, are you both suggesting that there's a plurality of questions, depending on the question, will determine the appropriate model of death? Part of the reason I'm asking is because Sami, you were talking about Kant and in his project, and in that sense, Kant was looking at some questions of free will about deterministic accounts of causation, human agency, compared with ones that rely on reasons, if you want to put it that way, and mental entities giving rise to actions. And there's a fundamental conflict. I mean, you take the Kantian project, he's talking about where there's completely different interpretations of the event that are clearly at conflict. I just wonder whether, in this case, is there a conflict between the naturalistic and the humanistic accounts of death, similar to what Kant was worried about?
Well, if you're asking me,
I suppose it just looks like most of the time there's different questions being asked, different problems, and occasionally there's a conflict when you come up to cases like this case you're talking about religion. When we define death, so religious groups will say death or life begins at a certain stage and so on. They're sort of pragmatic policy issues. Is there a fundamental conceptual kind of conflict here between these naturalistic and humanistic accounts of death?
well, the reason I very briefly invoked Kant, I didn't really talk about Kant, I just briefly mentioned that this very issue or this idea to have some kind of a synthesis between the medical and the humanistic perspectives would be Kantian in the sense that also Kant, it was a major concern for Kant to somehow make in his days deterministic natural science and then moral responsibility principles of the freedom of the will somehow compatible. And of course, you could disagree endlessly about interpretations of Kant, and I'm not sure I have any coherent interpretation to offer. But in a way, it comes back to the idea of having like a plurality of different ways of seeing one and the same matter or one and the same thing. Namely, if we think about human actions, they, in a way, they are, of course, from Kantian point of view, they are part of the deterministic natural world as natural events among many others. But then again, they are also seen in a different way from a different perspective, the perspective of morality or practical reason. There are also actions that are freely that we freely commit and we're responsible for. So in that sense, it's a matter of adopting a very broadly Kantian perspective on this whole issue. I don't want to add something to this in particular.
But so pluralism isn't so much a problem. It's more of a problem in Kantian. Set of problems that Kant was worried about. Pluralism would be a problem because he was trying to understand the relationship between the deterministic world and the world in which human freedom actually had an effect that was causally efficacious. So, I'm just curious because this seems a slightly different problem because pluralism seems okay here because there's different questions being answered. Whereas in Kant's case, it was the same question that the different approaches were oriented towards.
Well, I'm not sure different questions or. Of course, to talk about pluralism is already to update Kant.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not. You can just take Kant and apply a Kantian position to this. I mean, today you would have to bring Kant to this kind of discussion in some reinterpreted way, or at least you have to go beyond Kant's own views. And if we were to talk about Kant here directly, then we would probably have to invoke his theory of immortality as well, and that leads to completely different discussions. So
the only way for us to become immortal is to become cancer. That's the only solution.
Okay.
Okay, Mr. Green.
Well, for practical purposes, the definition and certainly criteria of death as opposed to life are necessary. I wonder how useful it is in philosophical general terms to understand death and life as dichotomies or as a dual pair of categories. I wonder if some is pragmatic pluralism, does it involve or include the possibility of understanding death and life as a kind of continuum with this different types of life and different types of death, and also different degrees of life. And your beloved example of non-life, the stove, already interacts with organic material a lot, and minerals are an essential part of life, and so on and so forth. I mean, can you, Sami, extend your pluralism to kind of a non-dichotomic understanding?
Yeah, I mean, Hanno probably wants to continue about this, but maybe if you're asking directly about my approach to that, I would be happy to at least take seriously the possibility of having such a non-dichotomous understanding of death and life. They are in any way they are concepts and phenomena that are inextricably tied to each other. You can't understand one without the other, whether or not you're concerned with defining them. You can't have any sort of understanding without them, without also understanding the other to some extent. And for instance, as the difficulties in clearly identifying when the process of dying begins, for instance, or when the moment of death occurs. I think those would already be examples that point toward the kind of continuation that you seem to be invoking. Maybe Hanno.
Yeah, because I mean, this is exactly what we think, but we can talk about death only when we are talking about multicellular organisms. Basically, the bacteria do not die. They multiply and they are destroyed. But the multicellular organism must die. And the fact is that, again, you have here an exception. And the exception comes from the slime molds. They are unicellular. But then when they start breeding, they gather together and they make the breeding organ, the mushroom. And then they send out the spores, and the breeding organ is needed for this process. After that, it doesn't die. It just is shedding out, and then they continue life being unicellulars again. There is no death whatsoever in this process.
Yeah, I appreciate the complexities in defining life, but at some point it seems that defining death would bring in additional complexities, and I'm wondering whether that is really necessary. So I would be inclined to say death is the loss of life, and then that might seem very simple, but might trigger a biological approach, for instance. But then all the complexities you would want to raise, you can raise in relation to life. And you still have this very simple definition of death. You can even talk about graduality or matter of degree, because loss might be a matter of degree. So what about death as the loss of life?
Mm-hmm. All right. Go ahead.
Define the life first. It's perfect. It's a perfect definition.
I think it's fine as a very general definition.
Yeah.
We might need to have, for other purposes, we might need to be more specific.
Yeah, but even for religious purposes, this might work, because the loss of life triggers all kinds of emotions and perhaps thoughts about the afterlife. So even for that purpose, it might get you quite far. I mean, yeah.
Well, I was thinking, actually, it's quite related to the last point, because I was thinking when you were talking about the chances for women that, you know, a lot of pregnancies don't go past the first weeks or whatever. I mean, I think one of the problems with how we process it is precisely we conceive of these as deaths. And really, if there's loss of life and it wasn't life to begin with originally, we should be just conceiving them as sort of quite apart from whether the death and life discussion. So in one sense, it's almost like stones. I mean, that's not to deny that people can suffer and feel a lot of grief in that sense, but it seems to me that one of the reasons one should, I'm a philosopher myself, but should take the biomedical classification seriously is that some things that we, you know, naturally would conceive of death and life might not in fact be death or life at all, and that, you know, biomedicine has some way of assisting us in thinking about it. But I guess you could take the other route and say, no, that this just shows that biomedicine is wrong, and we should, you know, conceive of, you know, very early fetuses as living as well. But then I would say then you're probably more religiously inclined or something.
Maybe if I can add something to that, just as a matter of clarification. When I said, for instance, that we may need to use different definitions for different purposes, that of course doesn't mean that any such definition or any such purpose would be as good as any other. I mean, we obviously we ought to be very critical of, for instance, certain religious or pseudo-religious ways of defining life in such a way that, for instance, some practices such as abortion become, for instance, completely forbidden as they might be in some religious groups. And that I think is again a matter where you need some philosophical reflection and also a reflection on the purposes for the definition.
The one aspect is the multitude of definitions, because I mean, different cultures, the people think completely different. And the Scott Gilbert has written a book on this topic, on bioethics. And for example, he tells a story about the Indians that gave the name for the babies at the age of 2, because it didn't make sense to give names for younger babies, because they died in numbers. When it looked like that they can survive, then they got the name. And their life began only after 2 years of age, so to say. Personalized life, with name.
Whereas in the Christian tradition, again, it's so different, because then you think that you have to give a name to the baby very early, because there is the idea that God calls a person personally by name, and so that kind of religious background idea is somehow part of the way in which the child is understood.
In our society that has the lowest perinatal mortality rate in the world, every single child is valued so much that if you go to developing countries, I mean, the death rate is 10 times higher. And people use these deaths, and they don't so much worry about this, because it's normal, and then it's natural. Here it's absent, and it's unnatural.
Okay, maybe I can try a sort of interim summary of some of these ideas. There's a multiplicity of concepts and criteria of threat of death, and those might be justified in terms of making them relative to certain purposes. I mean, one definition of criteria serves those purposes, another some other purposes, etc. And this would sort of help relocate the debate as a debate maybe about those purposes. Maybe those purposes require further justifications and maybe evaluation and maybe even ranking, some of them being more important than others, etc. And those purposes should also be put in relation to the relevant context or situation. Some purposes are okay in some contexts, but not in other contexts. So, but then again, I wonder if some purposes or some purposes in some contexts are not okay at all. They sort of become illegitimate purposes in those contexts. Then that reflect back to the concept or criterion that has been proposed in the first place. So this would sort of first be relocated the debate as a debate about purposes in context, but can't we now have a debate over these concepts themselves?
Maybe my immediate reaction to that would be that if we think of the questions concerning the justification of the different purposes, and maybe even the entire contexts, if we take that seriously and understand that as a kind of an ethical problem or need for needing ethical reflection, then what seems to follow is that the very project of engaging in the definition itself or considering the different definitions in relation to the purposes and contexts, that it's all the way from the beginning an ethical project, or at least there is an ethical dimension there all the way from the start. And so what that would mean then is that we can't really separate let's say the ontological and the maybe not the epistemological either, but at least the ethical dimension or the possibility of asking for an ethical justification for a certain practical context or purpose would be there always in the beginning when we consider the different definitions for the concepts. So I don't think that we could first just settle at an ethically neutral level what death is, and then consider the ethical questions that need to be considered when we need to think about our relation to death and life.
The question is also the value of life. I mean, does it have a superior value over death? And in our life, I mean, we can see and witness that it doesn't. Because the society is full of violence and mass murders and so forth. So that it's somehow people they have taken the power in their own hands, and they have decided that they have the right to kill others. But then this is what we know. But I mean, then one aspect is psychological aspect of being involved in death constantly. And that's really killing. And I know a couple of physicians working with intensive care units of preterm babies that have quit because they say that they didn't feel anything anymore. I mean, when you see constantly children die, and then you can't, and you always fail. Of course, you sometimes don't, but I mean, then they see also these failures. That gives you a very negative feedback, and that leads to depression, and that is really awful situation. So that the sorrow that you can see with the death in the parents also is reflected in the medical staff. And I think that it would be very nice to combine the definitions of death with sorrow feelings, because I mean, it's not neutral, never. It shouldn't be. At least it shouldn't be neutral.
I think that's mostly applicable to human deaths, though. I mean, deaths should be applicable to all organisms. If we include sorrow in the definition, then, I mean, if an organism with just a few cells dies, I'm not sure if anyone is going to mourn it. Did it still die though?
You're a philosopher, you can do this.
I think this is precisely the kind of case where we need this context sensitivity, so to say, and if we're interested in human death in particular, then sorrow is indeed something that we might want to include in the very concept, or at least the possibility of feeling sorrow or something.
if you're stepping on an ant and you are feeling sorrow, of course, it's your.
I just would perhaps agree more with something that Uskali was talking about earlier, that, well, you didn't use sorrow as an example, but that sorrow would be a consequence of death, or a possible consequence of death, particularly in the death of humans, but that it wouldn't be a part of the definition of death. I think it's not a necessary condition of death.
Certainly there are human deaths with no sorrow. I mean, somebody who just dies alone with no people at all, even though I mean that it's conceivable that there is no sorrow.
Or if the last human on the planet dies, and there's no one left to mourn her or him.
Maybe he's sorry about that.
Of course, then you could invoke such a notion as possible sorrow or whatever.
Doesn't that seem to be stretching it a little bit there?
Yes.
To complicating matters beyond
Yeah.
what's necessary?
Yeah, I agree.
Well, this cultural dimension has been mentioned as somehow significant for this issue, but so these concepts and criteria of death might be relative to cultures. And in different cultures, there are different attitudes towards death, different behavioral patterns towards death related to death, different cultural significance and values attached to death and life and so forth. And I think this might be a very important observation in contemporary world with all this globalization and all that, all these emerging conflicts here and there, all this sort of intercultural killing that goes on and all that. If different cultures appreciate death in different terms, then that's sort of an additional problem for these intercultural conflicts.
Or even if they even have different concepts of death, if they even define it. But that, as I mentioned, one of the problems there is, of course, this so-called cultural relativism, whatever we mean by that in more detail. I mean, then if any cultural understanding of death is as good as any other, then we're also getting into deep problems.
Right. Think of the legal consequences. I mean, how will that be accommodated in international law and so forth. Okay, I think there is some action.
No, it's just a small comment. I wanted to disagree with something I think was said before, that it would be perfectly fine to define that as the loss of life and then find the definition of life, because I think that's quite debatable. A lot of religions or other practices don't see death as anything that is lost as much as something that is gained. So you have all these ideas of death as simply a transition or death as a process. So the idea of loss, I don't think that's enough to define death and starting from life. You need something more. If you want to account for these other people who think that death is not a loss, but is a gain or a process and so on. So
The things you mentioned don't need to be part of the concept of death itself, right? And of course, that the transition and all that we can conceptualize as connotations of death, but it doesn't need to be part of the meaning.
yeah, but I think there are at least some cultural practices that do want that to be to not be related essentially to the idea of loss. I think that's part of it's one way of defining that as loss, but I don't think everyone would agree with that. I mean, I'm not giving my personal opinion, I'm just stating that some cultures don't think that as lost.
Okay, I think it's time to bring this to an end. I want to thank our speak as it was very, very interesting and exciting and deep. Given that we are all going to die, I would urge you to hurry and complete your project.
That is fantastic.